Rob Reiner spent decades making movies that felt safe. Stories you could quote, rewatch, and pass down. His name was tied to laughter, romance, and hope, the kind of filmmaker people trusted without thinking twice. So when his name suddenly appeared next to words like stabbing, arrest, and murder investigation, it felt unreal, almost wrong, like two worlds colliding that were never supposed to meet. Behind the warm smile and legendary career was a family quietly fighting something far darker. While audiences remembered fairy tales and feel-good endings, the Reiner household was locked in a long, painful struggle that never made headlines. A struggle filled with second chances, broken promises, and parents who believed love alone might be enough to save their child. What makes this story even harder to process is that none of this came out of nowhere. There were warning signs, private battles, moments where things almost seemed to turn around, only to fall apart again. And according to people close to the family, the signs were there right up until the very end. Because before Hollywood woke up to a nightmare, this was still a story about hope, forgiveness, and a family doing everything they could to hold itself together, not knowing how close they were to losing everything. For most of his life, Rob Reiner was the definition of comfort in Hollywood. He wasn't the loud celebrity chasing attention or controversy. He was the guy behind the camera, quietly shaping stories that made people feel understood. From The Princess Bride to When Harry Met Sally, his films weren't just popular, they became emotional landmarks. Movies people turned to when they needed joy, laughter, or a reminder that things could work out in the end. Before he ever became a celebrated director, audiences knew him as Meathead on All in the Family. The role made him a household name and earned him awards, but even then, those close to him say Rob always had bigger plans. He watched how scenes were built, how stories were told, how moments were controlled. Directing wasn't just a career move, it was where he felt most at home. When he finally stepped behind the camera, everything clicked. This is Spinal Tap turned into a cult phenomenon. Then came a run of films in the 80s and 90s that defined a generation. Colleagues often described him as joyful on set, constantly laughing, creating an environment that felt safe and collaborative. Actors trusted him. Crews loved working with him. To many, he didn't just direct films, he set the tone. Off-screen, that warmth followed him. With his bushy beard and gentle demeanor, people joked he looked like Santa Claus. He became known as someone deeply principled, outspoken about equality, education, and civil rights. Friends saw him as steady, thoughtful, and deeply devoted to his family. Not the kind of man anyone associated with chaos or violence. Which is exactly why what happened later felt so impossible to comprehend. Because while the world saw a calm, accomplished filmmaker who seemed to have figured life out, the reality at home was far more fragile. And the cracks were already forming, even as his career reached its most beloved heights. Long before tragedy entered the picture, the Reiners were already living with fear, just not the kind anyone could see. Behind closed doors, Rob and Michele were dealing with a problem that no amount of success, influence, or love could instantly fix. Their son Nick began experimenting with substances when he was still a teenager, and what started as concern quickly turned into a constant state of crisis. Rob later admitted that his first reaction came from panic. When he realized how young Nick was, he pushed hard for treatment, believing that acting fast would stop things before they spiraled. Nick was sent to programs, then more programs, cycling in and out of rehabs as the years went on. At times, he drifted so far away from stability that he ended up living on the streets. For parents who had spent their lives building stories with happy endings, this was a reality with no clear script. The hardest part wasn't just watching Nick struggle, it was watching their relationship break under the strain. Nick has openly said that being forced into treatment left him angry and resentful. Conversations turned tense. Trust eroded. The more Rob and Michele tried to help, the more complicated everything became. Eventually, they came to regret how aggressively they had tried to control the situation, realizing that fear had shaped many of their decisions. Still, walking away was never an option. Even during the worst moments, they stayed involved, emotionally and financially, hoping that one more chance might be the turning point. To outsiders, the family still looked intact. But privately, they were exhausted, constantly balancing between giving Nick space and keeping him close enough to protect him. And just when it seemed like the distance between them might become permanent, something unexpected happened. A project that forced them to face the pain head-on and, for a moment, brought them back together. In 2016, the line between Rob Reiner's work and his real life all but disappeared. That year, he released Being Charlie, a film about a teenager spiraling through addiction while his parents desperately try to pull him back. For audiences, it felt raw and uncomfortable. For the Reiners, it was something much deeper, a mirror they couldn't look away from. Nick co-wrote the film with his father, pulling directly from his own experiences. The story wasn't sanitized or softened. It reflected the anger, the chaos, and the emotional exhaustion that had defined what Nick later called his dark years. Suddenly, the struggle that had stayed mostly private was being explored in public, framed through art instead of silence. What surprised many people was what happened during that process. Instead of tearing them further apart, working on the film forced conversations they had avoided for years. In interviews at the time, Rob admitted that creating Being Charlie made him confront how little he truly understood what his son had been going through. Nick, in turn, said it helped him let go of much of the resentment he had been carrying. For a moment, things genuinely looked different. Rob spoke openly about feeling closer to his son than ever before. Nick said the anger he once felt toward his parents had almost completely faded. To those watching from the outside, it felt like a rare Hollywood story with a hopeful twist, proof that honesty and creativity could heal even the deepest wounds. But what few people realized was how fragile that peace really was. Because while the film captured the pain of the past, it couldn't guarantee the future. And once the spotlight faded, the real battle quietly resumed, with consequences no one could have predicted. Not long after Being Charlie was released, the optimism began to crack. The closeness Rob and Nick had spoken about didn't vanish overnight, but the stability everyone hoped for never fully arrived. Behind the scenes, Nick started drifting back toward the same destructive patterns his parents feared most. In later interviews, Nick admitted that the progress he made didn't last. He spoke openly about a period where things spiraled again, describing moments when he lost control and caused serious damage to his parents' property while under the influence. It wasn't just reckless behavior. It was a clear sign that the internal chaos had returned, stronger than before. For Rob and Michele, this was a painful reminder that recovery isn't a straight line. They continued trying to support Nick without pushing too hard, aware of the mistakes they felt they'd made in the past. Sometimes that meant letting him stay close. Other times, it meant stepping back and hoping space might help. Neither approach brought lasting peace. Despite everything, the family still showed up for each other publicly. They attended events together. They smiled for cameras. To outsiders, they looked united, even strong. But people close to them say that behind that image was constant uncertainty, a feeling that things could unravel at any moment. And while no one around them could have imagined how extreme the ending would be, there were signs that something wasn't right. The struggle never truly ended. It only went quiet for a while, right before everything reached a breaking point. The night before everything fell apart, the Reiner home was filled with people. It was supposed to be a normal holiday gathering. Familiar faces, casual conversations, the kind of evening Rob and Michele were known for hosting. From the outside, nothing about it suggested it would be remembered for anything other than another quiet family celebration. But according to multiple insiders, something felt off. Reports claim Nick was acting erratically throughout the evening, drawing uneasy glances from guests who couldn't quite put their finger on what was wrong. One source later said his behavior was freaking everyone out, not in a loud or explosive way, but in a tense, unsettling manner that lingered in the room. It was the kind of discomfort people notice but don't know how to address in the moment. Rob and Michele, by all accounts, tried to keep things calm. Those close to the family say this wasn't unfamiliar territory for them. They had spent years navigating situations like this, quietly managing concern without turning it into a scene. To them, this may have felt like another difficult night they would get through together. No one left that party thinking it was a final warning. There were no public arguments, no calls to authorities, just an unspoken sense that something wasn't right, and the hope that, like so many times before, it would pass. Less than 24 hours later, that uneasy feeling would take on a meaning no one in that room could have imagined, as Hollywood woke up to news that felt impossible to process. The next day shattered everything the Reiners had been holding together. On the afternoon of December 14th, the quiet of their Brentwood home was broken when Rob and Michele were found unresponsive. The house, a place long associated with warmth, family dinners, and decades of shared life, suddenly became the center of a police response no one ever imagined would be tied to their name. Emergency crews rushed to the scene after a call came in around mid-afternoon. According to people familiar with what unfolded, the situation inside the home was deeply disturbing. One source later described it as something out of a Hollywood horror scene nightmare, a phrase that spread quickly as the news began to leak beyond law enforcement. It was their daughter Romy, who lived nearby, who discovered them and called for help. Paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. Rob was 78. Michele was 70. Within hours, word began circulating through Hollywood, sending shockwaves across an industry that had grown up on Rob's work and trusted his steady presence for decades. That same night, police took Nick into custody. Authorities later confirmed he was arrested on suspicion of murder and was being held without bail. At the time of reporting, no formal charges had been announced, no motive had been confirmed, and investigators remained tight-lipped about what they believed led to the deaths. The suddenness of it all left more questions than answers. How did a family that appeared close, supportive, and deeply connected reach this point? What actually happened inside that house after the guests from the night before had gone home? As the investigation began, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a tragic ending. It was the beginning of a painful, public unraveling that forced people to look back at everything they thought they knew about the Reiners and wonder what had been missed. As news of Rob and Michele Reiner's death spread, Hollywood was left in stunned silence. Tributes poured in from friends, collaborators, and fans alike, all struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the tragedy unfolding. People remembered Rob not just as a director, but as a kind, joyful presence on set, someone who laughed constantly, brought out the best in those around him, and championed causes beyond the camera. Michele, too, was praised for her warmth, her creativity, and her tireless commitment to activism alongside her husband. Actors who had worked with Rob described him in deeply personal terms. Carol Kane, who starred in The Princess Bride, recalled the joy he brought to every scene. Another colleague from Stand By Me said Rob was like a parent on set, a special human being, words that now carried a heavier weight in light of the tragedy. Fans and industry peers alike expressed heartbreak over the loss of two extraordinary people who had shaped both film and community. Amid the tributes, questions loomed large. Authorities had taken Nick into custody, but the motive remained unconfirmed. People close to the family wondered if there had been warning signs that went unnoticed, or if the struggles with addiction and mental health had been far more complicated than anyone realized. Sources suggested that Nick had exhibited troubling behavior in the days leading up to the incident, but investigations were still underway and nothing had been officially confirmed. While speculation swirled, one point remained clear. Rob and Michele's lives had touched countless people, both on screen and off, and their absence left a void that could never be filled. Hollywood mourned not only for the legendary filmmaker and devoted mother, but also for the shocking, unanswered questions left in the wake of a family tragedy that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. And as the public waited for answers, the story became a stark reminder that even the brightest